Well, it's been said, but I'll say it again. Good morning. A lot of different ways to kind of open this, but I think I just kind of want to dig in. First thing I thought about is think back to the year 2000. Can you remember that? Some of y'all can't remember that because you weren't here. But 20 years ago, what was it like? What was it like for you? What's happened in the past 20 years? That has made a difference in your life, or even small changes, you know. I see lots of children here who weren't around in 2000, so that's made a difference in y'all's lives. I remember, y'all remember 2K, don't you? Some of y'all remember that? All the terrible things that were going to happen. All you computer people, weren't the computers going to blow up on the stroke of midnight at 2000? You know. I remember going outside of our house in Guthrie, which I still lived in Guthrie then, or we lived there, and wondering, okay, what's going to happen? You know, just looking around at midnight on that New Year's Eve. I think, was that the year that OU lost the Fiesta Bowl? Was that? No, maybe something. Anyway, I just remember that we watched a lot of football on that New Year's Eve because there were some new things happening there, and it was just kind of a weird night. We used to have a lot of New Year's Eve parties at our house, gatherings. And I just remember that night was a little bit different because we were all talking about what's going to happen. But what else has happened in 20 years in your life? Do we think about that as a long time ago? Do we think about that as, oh, well, that's just like yesterday? You know, and I was thinking about when I preached this last sermon, it was last Sunday, wasn't it? And sometimes these weeks just seem so long, and now I'm thinking, 20 years ago. So a lot can happen in 20 years. A lot can happen in 20 years. We might even think about that. Wow, that's really a long time. Well, last week we talked about Paul, who was called Saul at the time, and how his life had been just changed and rocked to its very core. And it wasn't so much that everything he believed in was changed, it's just how he was directed, how he was supposed to be about. And if you kind of look through his life, you know that certain aspects of it didn't change, but the direction did. And that's because God had a plan for his life that was very direct, very specific, and you know it was going to change the world. I shouldn't say the Christian world because the Christian world didn't exist. It's going to change the world with the introduction of this sect, this way, if you will, this Christianity that was really going to change how things were looked at. At that time, Saul was so certain about what he was about that he was even going after people, these Jews who had basically changed their allegiance, if you will, or had started to profess this man Jesus as being something special, as being the Son of God, as being the Messiah. And he was after them. But then after he was stopped on the road by Jesus and said, no, things are going to change for you, because you're going to be my person to go and speak to the Gentiles. So in one fell swoop, two things changed so drastically in Paul's life. First of all, he was trying his best to stamp out Christianity. And of course, as a Jew, he had nothing to do with Gentiles. And now all of a sudden, he's going to go into Gentile cities, into Gentile houses, and try to get them to be Christians. The very thing that he was trying to change. So his life changed significantly in how he was doing, but I think also some of the very basic tenets of his life changed, how he viewed things. I'm not sure if you would think of Paul or Saul at that time as being an arrogant sort of person. I think if you were to meet him and you were Jewish and you had become a Christian, you might think of him as arrogant because he was trying to get rid of you. Because he had all the answers. He knew what he was about. He knew what God wanted him to do. So I think there had to be a certain arrogance about him to do what he was doing. He had a confidence, if you will, to do what he was doing. But he was shown in no uncertain terms that his life was going to be different. His life was going to be totally different. And after he was talked to by Ananias, and he was baptized, he started that passion that he had for trying to get rid of Christians. he started preaching the word. He started going about his business of what God had wanted him to do in a very forward way. We know that we talk about the missionary journeys of Paul. The reason why we have the book of Acts is because there's an individual who worked with Paul on a fairly regular basis and went around the place with him, that guy named Luke. And he wrote the book of Acts to kind of explain, here's how things happened. Now, I asked about the 20 years because it's a timeline. You see, this didn't happen just overnight. This didn't happen, and sometimes I think when I was younger and I'd read the Bible, I'd think, okay, this happened this day, and this happened the next day, and this happened the next day. But no, there was time in here. You know, Saul was shown his mission probably about 2 to 3 years after Jesus ascended into heaven, after the crucifixion. I mean, there was time for this, the way, if you will, to really kind of take root in different places. And of course, when the Jews were scattered after Stephen's stoning, then that Christianity was also scattered. And that's why he was going to a different city to, had those letters to go and stamp out the Christianity there in the Jewish sect, if you will, in the Jewish way of life. But it was a few years. So here now Saul is, and it's time to take the gospel beyond the walls of Judaism. And so he begins to start on these missionary journeys. And of course, his first missionary journeys kind of still goes to Jewish cities, places where there are a lot of Jews, and they had synagogues. And the synagogues, of course, were formed so they could practice their religion still. But it was Saul's practice to go into a city, to go to a synagogue, and start preaching Jesus. And usually what happened is there were people there in the synagogue who were interested to hear what he had to say, and they were even converted, but there were always going to be some people who were against him. They didn't like the words he was saying. They thought he was just basically wrecking their whole way of life, and so he would eventually have to leave the synagogue and go out to the city and start preaching to the Gentiles in that city. And that's kind of his modus operandi everywhere he went. Okay? So we're in the book of Acts. By the way, this is all kind of a precursor to what you're seeing up there. And the next several weeks, we're going to be talking about treasures in jars of clay, which is something that Paul wrote about in 2 Corinthians. But I'll kind of give you a little bit of an introduction to today, if you will. So in Acts chapter 18, we find Paul on a missionary journey, and he's in Greece. Okay, and I don't mean that he's like hot oil. He's actually in a country, Greece, if you will. And it says, after this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. And there he met a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had ordered all the Jews to leave Rome. Now Paul went to see them, and because he was a tent maker as they were, he stayed and worked with them. And every Sabbath he reasoned in the synagogue, trying to persuade Jews and Greeks. So here we have Paul coming into the city of Corinth. Now Corinth is a port city, or it has ports with it, and it's, at least at that time, is a fairly wealthy city. There's a lot of people. It's also fairly multinational. There's a lot of different individuals there. But there's also a Jewish contingent, obviously. And he meets up with a Jew named Aquila and Priscilla, who've come from Italy, because they basically got thrown out of their city. And they happen to be the same sort of thing that Paul is, which is a tent maker. In other words, Paul is doing his best to make a living while he is preaching, while he is sharing the word. Okay? So it's not like, there are times when Paul has support from other individuals, but right now Paul is trying to support himself in this city of Corinth. And as I said, he's kind of doing his thing, which is going and talking to the Jews at the synagogue, trying to persuade them. Now in verse 5, when Silas and Timothy came from Macedonia, Paul devoted himself exclusively to preaching, testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Christ. But when Jews opposed Paul and became abusive, he shook out his clothes in protest and said to them, "Your blood be on your own heads. I am clear of my responsibility. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles." Then Paul left the synagogue and went next door to the house of Titius Justus, a worshiper of God. Crispus, the synagogue ruler, and his entire household believed in the Lord, and many of the Corinthians heard him and believed and was baptized. And even it says, one night the Lord spoke to Paul in a vision, do not be afraid, keep on speaking, do not be silent, for I am with you, and no one is going to attack and harm you because I have so many people in this city. So Paul stayed a year and a half preaching them the word of God. And I say, sometimes I think we don't really consider the timeline. Paul lives in Corinth for a year and a half. That's fairly significant, wouldn't you say? That's a good amount of time, especially in that day when you're pretty much around everybody, because we're not talking about millions of people in a city. You know, the city is fairly prosperous. It's a fairly big city for that time. But still, there's a limited number of people. And Paul is able to stay in that city for a year and a half and establish a fairly strong church, it would seem. And after a year and a half, you know, he packs up and he moves on because his missionary journey is going. Like I say, I think sometimes when I was growing up, when we were talking about Paul's missionary journeys, I thought, okay, now today I'm going to be in Athens, and tomorrow I'm going to be in Corinth, and the next day I'm going to be in Ephesus. No, he would go someplace and stay a while. So this is taking years, okay? He was probably in this city about the year 49 or 50. So this is about 17 years after he became a Christian, after he was given his mission. It's been about 17, 18 years since he started this journey. And he's already made several stops in other cities. He's already made several churches, congregations, if you will. He has been spreading the word now for a while. And so this is about, like I said, 18, 19 years into his missionary time. And he stays there for about a year and a half. And I would think in that time, he's really starting to develop his message. He's really starting to develop how he does things. Like I said, he's got kind of this thing he does, goes to the synagogue, goes to the Gentiles. And people are responding. Okay, that's important for us to remember, that people are responding. There are men and women in these cities who are interested in what he has to say, and they appreciate it, and they come to accept it. So he is leaving his stamp on so many different places. But here is this town of Corinth, and we know the town of Corinth, right? We've heard about that name before. I was trying to think in our day and time, what does the word Corinth mean to us besides, the letters? All I could think of was Corinthian leather. I remember, somebody always talking about Corinthian leather. That's the first thing I thought about. But Corinth was the city in Greece, which, like I said, is fairly prosperous. My understanding is some years later, there was a big earthquake and basically wiped out the city. There is still a Corinth in place, by the way. It's not just an ancient city. It's about 2 to 3 miles south of where the original city was. But these people in that day, from a long time ago, came to accept what Saul or Paul had to say to them. And then he moved on. And then something happened. Something happened. And unfortunately, that's always kind of the truth. How many letters do we have from Paul after the book of Acts? How many Pauline epistles? I always love that phrase, Pauline epistles. And why did he write those letters? Why did he have things to say? And that's because he had gone to these places to put into place this Christianity, and when he left, others came in and began to change the message a little bit. And depending on what city it was, and depending on what church it was, and depending on where people came from, the changes were different. So every letter usually deals with a situation, a problem. Things have taken place in the city that he left, where the congregation was going, that needed some direction. Now, from our perspective, we might say, well, that's a lot of stuff, but there wasn't all these letters. There wasn't all this instruction. What did they have to work with? What did those people have to work with? Well, for the most part, they had word of mouth, because the Gospels, for the most part, had not been written yet. They had the Old Testament, although at that time it would have been just a testament, because it really hadn't become old. And then you've got a bunch of Gentiles coming into the church, and they don't even have the Jewish background of religion. So how are things to be understood? Well, you've got the teaching that Paul left with them, and I'm sure those were good teachings. He talks about that, how they came to understand Jesus. But there still needed to be some written document, if you will. And now we've got this. We have these books. We have this book here that we call the Bible, which is really a series of books. And all these letters that talk about the different issues that are going on, they didn't have that. So you had people come in and they would say things and they would change things, and Paul would have to address what's going on. And somewhere along the way, somewhere in the following 50s, I don't exactly know what year, word reached Paul that things weren't all that wonderful in Corinth because they were developing divisions. People were not together anymore. And I think about that and I think, oh, wow, big mystery, right? Because as I explained to many people, I hope you think this is funny, what's the biggest problem with the church? People. You know, if we didn't have people, well, we wouldn't have the church, I realize that, but it's always people. Because, of course, we have our ideas, we have our feelings, we have our thoughts, we have our ways of doing things. And if we don't rely on the absolute authority and power of God, then we're always going to have problems. Because in this room right here, as we look around, who is the ultimate authority? In this room right here. Let's put God aside for just, let's not really put him aside, but let's put him aside. Who's the ultimate authority in here, okay? Okay, Eric, are you it? Let's listen to everything Eric says, and whatever he says, we're going to do. And Melanie's going, mm-mm. Okay, Matt, you're it, right? You want to be it? No? It's kind of ludicrous to even say that, isn't it? Because as humans, we do not have that ultimate authority. We do not have that standing to say, here's the decision we make. And yet, throughout history, it's always been true that people have drawn followers. Because someone has come and talked to us, and we like what they have to say. When Paul was living in Corinth to begin with, there were people who liked what he had to say. And so they came to understand Christ through his message. When he left, what happened? Other people came along. Other people came along and had a message. And you started having people who would splinter and start following someone else. 1 Corinthians is written with that kind of intent because Paul has gotten this message. Hey, things are not happening well here because there are divisions in the church. Now, you've heard of the name Apollos. You've heard of the name of Peter. You've heard of Jesus. Now, I want you to picture this Corinthian church here. Let's just pretend like we're the Corinthian church. Now, all of y'all over here, you profess to follow Apollos. That's because you like what he had to say. All of you over here, you liked what Peter had to say. All of us in the middle, we follow Jesus. How long before this body fractures? How long before this body just splinters apart? Because Apollos isn't necessarily going to say what Peter says, not necessarily going to say what Jesus says, or even what Paul said. But Paul goes back to, hey, the message is from who? It's Jesus. Don't follow Paul, don't follow Apollos, don't follow Peter, follow Jesus. And they're not understanding totally that Jesus is the ultimate answer, if you will. 1 Corinthians beginning in chapter 1, beginning in verse 26. Let's just read this. Brothers, think of what you were when you were called. Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many were influential. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. He chose the lowly things of this world and the despised things and the things that are not to nullify the things that are, so that no one may boast before him. It is because of him that you are in Christ Jesus, who has become for us wisdom from God, that is, our righteousness, holiness, and redemption. Therefore, as it is written, let him who boasts, boast in the Lord. What is Paul reminding these Corinthians? And by the way, I'm trying to kind of get to a point where we're starting this whole message. Because I think Paul's outlook on life has been changing as he's been living and doing this message. At one time, he was this arrogant person out to, I'm going to go and destroy these people because they're not following the way. And now it's like, let's rethink this. There was a time, he says, when we're talking about the Corinthian Christians, there was a time when you weren't very wise, at least not by human standards. You weren't very influential. You weren't very noble. You know, what does that say to us today? You know, who do we look up to? Who do we think of as being powerful? Who do we think of as being the ones we should follow? Is it a sports figure? Maybe you're really into basketball or football or something else, and you think, wow, that person really has it. You know, when I was growing up, I'm trying to remember when he actually played. I remember, was it the 80s, but Michael Jordan played? I remember the first time they started talking about, he started doing all the commercials, and he was a name brand. Now, what does that mean, name brand? People listened to him, and guess what? They came out with a shoe that were Jordans, and I think that was the first time I ever heard of a shoe over $100. Who would pay $100 for a pair of tennis shoes? A lot of people. And wouldn't you like to have that first pair again? But it's probably worth a lot more now. But that's one, is it a sports figure that you really want to listen to because they are powerful, because they have wealth, because they have ability? Maybe it's a singer. Is there some singer that you just think is hung the moon? They're great. Remember those pictures back in the 60s and 70s when Elvis came out and started singing, and what was everybody doing? Screaming, and people would faint. That was kind of a weird thing, wasn't it, to see that? I grew up in that time too. I grew up a lot of times. Maybe it's the Beatles, I don't know. What's today? Who do you follow? Maybe it's an actor or an actress that you think's just really got a great voice. Maybe it's a businessman. Who is it that we idolize today? Who is it that we want to listen to today? And Paul says, when I came to Corinth, you were neither wise, nor noble, nor influential. When you came to accept Christ, what's happened? Why does he say those things to them right then? I'm assuming what's happened is they've become wise and influential. I think the church began to be a bit more affluent, if you will. Now, I think this is true because I've seen figures on it. When the church is usually under stress, when the church is usually being pushed upon, is sometimes when they have their best growth. Because who does the church have to rely on when they're looked down upon? Well, they have to rely on God, don't they? Back in the day, when Paul's talking here, the church experienced phenomenal growth when they were being persecuted. When it became accepted to be in church, to be a part of the way, to be a Christian, then you start getting people in who are not just servants, not just slaves, not just downtrodden, but all of a sudden, well, now I've got people of wealth, people of influence. And the church began to experience problems. That's what happened in the church of Corinth. You've got people there that are saying, well, I'm better than that. We need to change the way. I don't want to do that. I don't want to be a part of that. We need to change a little bit so it looks better. It sounds better. You know? You remember the story of Naaman back in the Old Testament? Why did he not want to do what the prophet of God told him to do to get rid of his leprosy? Why did he not want to do that? You remember? Well, that river is dirty. Can't we go to a river that's clean? That's simple, right? And yet that's the truth. We as people, we don't necessarily want, well, I don't like that idea. You mean I have to actually talk to those people? I mean I have to actually be nice to those people? I don't like those people. Well, you're missing the point. And that's what happened in Corinth here. Paul is talking to them about the fact that you're missing the point. At one time you understood Jesus, but now you're following these different people and you're splintering. You're separating out because you become influential, you become wise by the world standards. And so I can only imagine how hard it was to write this letter for Paul, because he's going to spend a lot of chapters just kind of beating up on them and reminding them that you have forgotten where you started. And you have forgotten that Jesus loved you still. God, it says, chose lowly things, despised things, things that are not. Why would he choose that kind of stuff? Why would he choose someone who was so lowly? Why would he choose a place of birth that was basically in a cave? Why would he choose a young boy to be king of his nation who was thought of as just not even worth talking about? Why does God choose things that from our eyes, are not very acceptable? Because who's in charge? Because who's in charge? If I do something, well, then I'm the one that gets the glory. But if you look at me and kind of say, well, he shouldn't be doing that, but he still does, whose glory is it then? And Paul is reminding these people in 1 Corinthians, you started very lowly, but Jesus still loved you and took care of you. Keeping on reading in chapter 2. When I came to you, brothers, I did not come with eloquence or superior wisdom as I proclaimed to you the testimony about God. What's Paul saying about himself? I don't speak good. I don't talk good. I didn't talk good. I didn't come to you with great flowery words. I'm not a great orator. I'm not a great preacher. So what did he come with? For I resolved to know nothing while I was with you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. I came to you in weakness and fear and with much trembling. My message and my preaching were not with wise and persuasive words, but with a demonstration of the Spirit's power, so that your faith might not rest on men's wisdom, but on God's power. I think maybe sometimes we think of Paul as being this great preacher, and apparently he wasn't. Apparently he wasn't even a great writer. A lot of times he'd have to have somebody else write it. He might speak it, but, it's God given the words, but he constantly talks about the fact that he was not the one to emulate. He was not the one to put up on a pedestal. And now you've got things happening in Corinth that says, well, I believe in Paul, I believe in Apollos, I believe in... And Paul says, no, it's not about any of us. We all come to you with weakness. If I were to ask around the room, and I'm not, please don't do this. If I were to ask, tell me your weaknesses. Tell me your weaknesses. What are they? Can you be honest with yourself, and what are your weaknesses? What are the things that you struggle with? I appreciate so much. I'm going to pick on, is Michael here? Yeah, there you go. Pick on him a little bit, okay? Because a couple of weeks ago, it's about a month now since you first led singing. Did you have to be kind of talked into that? It was a growth thing, wasn't it?
It was kind of like ball and told.
Ball and told, I like that. Does a great job, don't you think? Never would have thought of that as his gift, would you? I don't know, maybe you do. But in weakness, you find strength. In other words, the ability to say, okay, I'll try it. Because where does strength come from in the church? And if it doesn't come from God, if we don't believe it comes from our faith in Jesus, then we're missing the point. Paul wrote this letter to the Corinthians to remind them that they are not the glory. They are not the be-all and end-all. They were splintering the church apart because they thought of themselves as something special. And they are special in God. They are special as members of the body. And that's what we're going to be talking about, because Paul was able, it appears, to resolve some of these issues. I think I've also figured out that after this letter, he also made a journey to them. It wasn't just in words, but it was also face-to-face. And boy, I still prefer face-to-face. I prefer that to anything. If we're going to have a conversation, let's sit down and talk. Let's talk. And Paul came to them and talked to them and said, we got to fix these things. And apparently, things got better, because he was able to write the book of 2 Corinthians. This is where we're going to start here in a couple of weeks. We're going to start looking at what God is doing in our world. And we're going to talk about us as a congregation, us as a church. Where can we go? What can we do this year? What kind of difference can we make in this world? But the first thing we have to know is that it's not us, it is God. And we have got to firmly plant ourselves on God's side. We cannot be followers of Apollos or Peter or pick a name. We have got to be on God's side. We want to make a difference. I think we all do. I think we as a congregation long to make a difference in our community. We long to make a difference here in this part of Oklahoma and other parts of the world as well. We want to make a difference in each other's lives as we look around. But how do we do that? How do we go about following those ideals, those dreams? First and foremost, we've got to be like Paul. See, I think Paul figured this out. That's why he's writing about this. He understood that I am not the one. And by the way, he became so selfless that he was willing to be thrown out, beaten, rejected. If you really kind of look through Paul's life, he had a kind of a miserable existence for a while. I mean, a lot of bad things happened to him. And I'd ask the question, why do you keep doing this? You go in other words, you heard what I said at the beginning. What's the first thing he would do? Go into the city? He'd go to the synagogue. What's going to happen in the synagogue? He's going to get rejected. He's going to get thrown out. It happens every time. Any of y'all ever did cold calls? How many times do you hear people either hang up or don't want to talk to you? Or knock doors? And I think one time we were doing something like that, and they said, "Oh, you can expect rejection about 8 to 9 times out of 10." I don't know about y'all, but I get beaten down after a while, and I don't want to do that. And here Paul does it for years. He knows when he goes in a city, he's going to be rejected. There's a chance he might be on trial for something that he didn't even do. There's a chance he'll be beaten. There's a chance he's going to be shipwrecked. There's a chance he's going to end up in jail in Rome for doing something he didn't do. So why did he keep doing it? And I think he came to understand that it wasn't about him. It was not about him. And his whole life was given over to the fact that he wanted to serve Jesus. The reality of what Paul was saying is God's in charge. God's in charge. And through God's power, Paul and us can make a difference in this world. But our first and foremost job is going to be to plug into that power. We are the jars of clay. We are these vessels that are very fragile. And trust me when I say the older I get, the more fragile I understand. Friday, my knee just started hurting. I have no idea why. I didn't do anything to it. It just hurts. Why is that? Why can't I just keep? Because I have this fragile vessel. And brothers and sisters, we're going to talk about these fragile vessels and the fact that God has placed within us fantastic treasure. Now, I don't know about y'all, but normally if I get something nice, I don't put it in some old musty, dusty box. You want to put it in something special, right? God says we're special. Now, we're going to talk about that. I'm just curious, how many of y'all have got verses up in your house now? Did y'all write a little card and put it on your mirror? Oh, come on. That's your first goal this year. Find a verse that really speaks to you, and I appreciate the verse on the front of our little marquee. Find a verse you like and put it up on your mirror. Where do you look every day? Where do you look every day? And I mean, for me, I look in the mirror on my bathroom. I don't want to, but I have to, make sure. So, yeah, right there. Put something up. We're looking for 12. In 12 months, we want to have 12 verses up where you see them all the time. What's it going to be? What's it going to be? I challenge you to start working on that, okay? I pray that the words that I'm sharing with you are making a difference in your life. They're making a difference in my life. I pray for this congregation that we will see ourselves moving forward